Hello, my friends, and welcome to the Seeds and Weeds podcast, brought to you by Small House Farm. If you're looking to celebrate plants and the people that love them, then this is the podcast for you. Thanks for joining us. I'm your host, Bevin Cohen. We've got a super fun episode for you today. We're going to be sitting down with Sarah Hall to talk about her new book, Sown in the Stars. This is a fascinating exploration of working with the moon phases and astrological signs to guide your planting schedule. It was a really great conversation, just packed full of good info. So you're going to want to stick around for that. Now, here at Small House, I'm on my last weekend of workshops for the year. Heather and I, we're going to be visiting some libraries here around the state for some herbal tea tasting events. And once those are done, it is time for some winter hibernation. You know, winter's the perfect time to rest and recharge. We've already got some big things planned for next year, so it'll be nice to have a little bit of time off. I say time off, but what I really mean is time at home. I'm going to be spending most of the winter writing and planning some spring events. One of the events we're already working on, it's our annual seed swap that takes place every February. Now, it's called the Central Michigan Seed Swap, but folks come from all over the place to enjoy the day. We've had seed swappers from 10, 12 different states show up over the years. Last year's swap saw like 900 something people through the door, so it's quite a seedy party. Next year's seed swap will actually be in a new venue. Now we need something bigger to contain all the excitement. So that's pretty cool. I'm excited about it, but moving into a new place does mean a little bit more work for us. You know, we've been in that last venue for a few years now, so everything's kind of got its own groove going on. So there's going to be some growing pains in this new place, but it's going to be great. I love seeing all the people come together to talk about gardening and sharing their seeds with each other. I'll put the link to the Seed Swap website down in the show notes if you want to check it out. It's the biggest seed swap in the Midwest, and we would love to see you there. For my winter writing, I'm currently working on a book project for Ogden Publications. I'm writing about food preservation. We're exploring the history of various food preservation techniques, you know, from canning and pickling to smoking and curing meats and everything in between. So we're digging into the history of the methods, but also how they've evolved into modern times and how we can use these same techniques to preserve our harvest at home. And there's going to be a ton of recipes in the book, too. That's been my favorite part to work on. So I'll keep you in the loop as the book moves forward. But we're actually looking at a spring or summer 2024 publication date. So you can expect some updates pretty soon. Now, before we jump into the interview, I'd like to give a quick shout out to our latest Patreon members. It's the support of our patrons that makes this show possible. So today, I'd like to say thank you to Jessica Allen, Mary Matt, Patsy Morgan, and Kendra R. Thank you so much for being a part of our community. And for those of you listening, if you enjoy the podcast and would like to show your support, please consider joining the Patreon. There's plenty of membership perks, and you're helping us to keep Seeds and Weeds on the air. And that's pretty cool, right? You can find the link to our Patreon down in the show notes or at seedsandweedspodcast.com. Sarah Hall is an associate professor of agriculture and natural resources at Berea College in Kentucky. Her scholarly articles on the restoration of native forests have been published in a wide range of journals. And today, Sarah's joining us on the show to talk about her new book, Sown in the Stars. Sarah Hall, welcome to the podcast, my friend. I am so excited to have you here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, you've got this new book out. It's called Sown in the Stars. But before we dig into it, could you just tell our listeners a little bit about your background, your work at Berea College, and your background as a gardener?
Sure. Yeah. I am a faculty member in the Department of Agriculture and Natural Resources at Berea College, and I have been here since 2011. So I've been here for a little while, and this project actually sort of came out of a class that I developed here, and it was a sabbatical project from 2018 to 2019 when I actually conducted the interviews. In terms of gardening, I have been doing that on my own. You know, don't do a huge scale garden, but try to produce for myself and my family and enjoy trying new things and that sort of thing.
I was really intrigued by this idea of using the astrological signs to sort of dictate your planting schedule. And I'd like it if you could kind of unpack that idea for the listeners a little bit. I have a friend who plants by the moon. He uses the moon phases to determine when is the best time to plant or not to plant, depending on the phase of the moon. Is that similar to this, or is this something different?
It is similar. It's really the same. So there's two different components of this. One is actually the moon phase, and the moon phases in particular. So that's, most listeners are probably familiar with within one moon cycle, we will go from, a new moon around to full and then back around to a new moon. And at the most basic level, that sort of top half, when the moon is getting larger or waxing, so between new and full is when you would want to plant your above ground crops. So anything that produces what you harvest above the ground. And then between the full and the new moon is when the moon is getting smaller, or some people will call it the old moon. That's when you would want to plant your root crop. So anything that produces below the ground that you actually harvest. So that's kind of at the most basic level what it is. But then ideally within those halves, you also want to hit good signs or days when the sign is in a good favorable one. So there are 12 different signs. Most people are familiar with what we would call your sun sign, which is essentially which of those constellations was on the other side of the sun from the perspective of the earth when you were born. So we have 12 of those. So essentially 1 month in each of those. But this is actually thinking about the moon sign. So within that 28 or so day cycle of the moon, you've got 2 to 2.5 days in each of the 12 signs. And so the moon sign is which of those is on the other side of the moon from the perspective of the earth. And again, it's going to change, 2 to 2.5 days. You'll go from one into another.
Okay. So could you give us a simple example of using these signs? Let's say for maybe beans. I like to grow a lot of beans. What would be the best sign for planting a bean?
There are a lot of sources and a number of people that I interviewed who will say that Gemini or the twins or the arms, that's all names for the same thing, that those are the best days to plant beans in. Although there are some sources that say that's not necessarily the case, but there does seem to be quite a strong tradition of planting your beans in the arms or the Gemini or twin days. And so ideally you would hit it on, again, both that waxing moon, so between the new and full, and then you would also hit it on Gemini days to get your beans just to do really, really well. And one of the people that I interviewed, Phil Case, he has been putting out a column in the State Journal in Frankfort, Kentucky for decades now. And he talks about the first year that he tried to do this. He learned from a neighbor of his, and it happened to be a year when he was able to hit both the right phase of the moon and the twin days. And he said his beans just grew and grew. His wife, he said they canned, they froze. And he said, finally, we just pulled the darn bean plants up because we were just done. But that's an example. He's somebody who has an eye on this a lot and said that kind of during the time when we would normally be planting beans, a lot of times you'll have those twin days, but they'll be on the wrong phase of the moon. And so trying to get both of those together is sometimes a little bit tough, but when it happens, at least his personal experience said it definitely worked.
Oh man, that's way cool. The book, of course, the subtitle here, Planting by the Signs, and a lot of these astrological signs dictate our planting schedule, but does it also dictate our harvesting schedule?
Yeah, so there are, it is interesting. Not a whole lot of people that I talked to spoke about harvesting in particular, but a lot of the written references, the almanacs and calendars will talk about harvesting. And a number of people that I spoke with talked in particular about harvesting potatoes and wanting to do that to be sure that you're on the old moon, essentially the fourth quarter, when you harvest your potatoes. And people would say that, even if you stick them clean through, that they would heal over and still store and keep well if you did them in that right phase. Whereas if you were on the wrong phase, they wouldn't heal over and they would end up rotting on you. So that was one example of harvesting that came up in multiple interviews, was in particular for potatoes. Right on. And now I noticed that most of the folks, maybe all of the folks from the book that you interviewed, are all from Kentucky. That's right. Yes. Yeah. That was kind of when I initially thought about the project, I wasn't sure how many folks I'd be able to find. And I thought I might might have to broaden it a little bit, but it ended up seeming like that was a good number of people, and I was able to find the number that I'd wanted just within the state. So
how were you able to track these people down that are still using these old techniques?
So it largely was sort of word of mouth, and something that I have since learned is called snowball sampling. I guess this was, a little bit different than kind of my academic background in the past, but I would do one interview and then that person would say, oh, you really need to talk to so-and-so. Some of my students at the time ended up connecting me with folks that I interviewed. There's a staff member here who connected me with one of the people, even my dental hygienist, actually her grandmother. When I was getting my teeth cleaned, we were chit-chatting about things, and she said, oh yeah, my grandmother does that. And so, certainly it seems like there's still quite a few people that are doing it.
That's awesome. I saw that you had Bill Best in the book.
Yeah. He's very well-known heirloom seed saver, and he learned from his neighbor who was drying her beans down for leather breeches or shucky beans in his greenhouse, and he noticed that hers kept their color a lot better than his. And she sort of said, well, I didn't want to say anything, but I've noticed you've been planting yours under the wrong sign. And so he started taking his calendar to her to have her mark when it was a good sign. And that was in Gemini, or the arms, according to his neighbor.
So if I want to try planting by the signs, where do I find that information about when the signs are where and what they're doing?
Yeah, so everybody who does this, except for there was one person that I interviewed who actually just looks at the moon and goes by the moon phases, but all the others use an almanac or a calendar of some kind. So the old farmer's almanac with like the yellow cover is what most people are familiar with, but there are other versions. So you can use those, or you can get a calendar that has essentially the same kind of information. Most of the people that I interviewed with do actually use a calendar because they keep their records on it too, right? So they'll write down when they planted or harvested and how much and all that kind of stuff on their actual calendar. And my understanding is that, and I have a chapter where I talk about the different calendars and almanacs and their similarities and differences. There are different systems that can be used to calculate these things. So not all calendars exactly line up. Many times the almanacs or calendars won't necessarily tell you what system they're using. They are all fairly consistent in saying that their system is the best, so you should buy theirs, right?
Sure.
So that tends to be what's consistent.
Well, now, when you were working on the book, and especially in the last chapter, you talk about this, you were experimenting in your garden by planting along with the signs as well to see how it worked out for you. Do you have any notable success stories that you could attribute to when you were planting your seeds?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's hard because on the one hand, I was lucky in that we got sent home for the pandemic mid-March. And it was after I had done the interviews and as I was writing the book. And so that meant that I had a lot more time during that year's garden to really try to pay attention and follow the signs. And so, I certainly had the best garden that I have really ever. I can't separate out the fact that I had more time to dedicate and to pay attention and was able to plan a little bit more because of that time. So, but my winter squash did really good that year, better than I've had really definitely since. My peppers did good. The way our season runs, I'm getting peppers. I get peppers only really right at the end, and then the frost hits and I'm losing out on peppers, and they did quite well that year as well.
That's interesting, because same here. My 2020 garden was the best I've ever had, and I certainly wasn't planting by the signs. I was just had all this time in the world to be out there, so that is hard to say. So are you going to try to stick with planting by the signs in future years to see if it improves your garden production?
Yeah, I'm definitely, writing down when I'm doing things, paying attention to my calendar and trying to follow the signs as much as I can. It feels a little wrong not to pay attention at all now. I'm especially paying attention for things that are more hit or miss for me, that I've had only some successful years on. That's where I'm really trying to pay attention to it, especially.
Well, right on. Where you need the help, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Now, if folks wanted to connect with you or pick up a copy of your book, Sown in the Stars, what are the links that they're going to need to be able to find you?
The book can be found on, Amazon or on Bookshop, any of the independent booksellers' websites as well. It's published by the University Press of Kentucky, and you you can also just buy directly from the publisher as well. That should get you there. For some reason, Amazon likes to autocorrect to down in the stars instead of sown in the stars. But if you tell it, no, I did in fact want sown in the stars, it will pop up for you.
That's funny. All right, I'm going to put all those links down in the show notes too, so folks can just click right on through and get themselves a copy of the book. Thanks again for being on the show, Sarah. This was a great conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Well, what do you know? It's the end of another show. Thanks again to Sarah Hall for being our guest and to all of you for tuning in. Remember, if you'd like to support our show, you can always join the Patreon. You can find that link and many more at seedsandweedspodcast.com. This episode was edited and produced by all of us here at Small House Farm, and the music you're enjoying right now is Ragamuffin by Jeff Hardy. Thanks again for joining the fun. I'm Bevin Cohen, and we'll see you next time.